The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations will come to order. Today, the subcommittee continues our bipartisan work investigating conditions in prisons, jails, and detention centers across the United States. I thank the ranking member for his cooperation. In July, we released findings of corruption, abuse, and misconduct in the federal prison system and questioned the now former director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Today, after a 10-month bipartisan investigation, we can reveal that despite a clear charge from Congress to determine who is dying in prisons and jails across the country, where they are dying, and why they are dying, the Department of Justice is failing to do so. This failure undermines efforts to address the urgent humanitarian crisis ongoing behind bars across the country. Our investigation has revealed that last year alone, according to GAO analysis that I requested, the Department of Justice failed to identify at least 990 deaths in custody, nearly 1,000 uncounted deaths, and the true number is likely much higher. We will hear today from Belinda Maley and Vanessa Fano, whose loved ones died preventably while in custody. In both cases, sons and brothers who died while they were pretrial detainees, having been convicted of no crime. We will hear their grief and anger, a grief and anger shared by many thousands of Americans whose loved ones needlessly suffered and died while incarcerated. We will hear from Professor Andrea Armstrong of Loyola University to understand why and how DOJ's failure to oversee prisons and jails undermines Americans' civil rights. We will hear from Dr. Greta Goodwin of the Government Accountability Office, a legislative branch agency that provides investigative services to Congress, which analyzed at my request the death and custody data that DOJ collected in 2021, and who will publicly report those findings today for the first time. And we will question Ms. Maureen Henneberg, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, about the Department's failure since 2019 to implement the Death in Custody Reporting Act, a failure that has undermined federal oversight of conditions in prisons and jails nationwide, and therefore undermined Americans' human and constitutional rights. Members of Congress swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, to defend the constitutional rights of all Americans in my state and every state, including the rights of those who are incarcerated. And we are here today because what the United States is allowing to happen on our watch in prisons, jails, and detention centers nationwide is a moral disgrace. As federal legislators serving on the nation's preeminent investigative panel, it is our obligation to investigate the federal government's complicity in this disgrace. Therefore, it's our obligation to ask what tools the Department of Justice is using to protect the constitutional rights of the incarcerated, to hold DOJ accountable when it fails to use those tools, and to furnish better, more powerful tools with which the Department can defend civil rights and civil liberties. There are some bright spots. For example, I was encouraged when Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark announced a DOJ investigation of conditions in Georgia's horrific state prisons almost 1 year ago today. But it has become clear in the course of this investigation that the Department is failing in its responsibility to implement the Death in Custody Reporting Act. That is, the Department is failing to determine who is dying behind bars, where they are dying, and why they are dying, and therefore failing to determine where and which interventions are most urgently needed to save lives. In 2000 and then again in 2014, Congress passed the Death in Custody Reporting Act, also known as DICRA, tasking DOJ with the collection and analysis of custodial death data nationwide. DOJ itself describes this law as, quote, an opportunity to improve understanding of why deaths occur in custody and develop solutions to prevent avoidable deaths. For nearly 20 years, DOJ collected and published this data, an invaluable resource for the Department, for the Congress, and for the public. Then, abruptly, the publication stopped. and our investigation followed. We found that in recent years and over multiple administrations, the department's implementation of this law has failed, despite clear internal warnings from DOJ's own Inspector General and DOJ's Bureau of Justice Statistics. For example, in the first quarter of fiscal year 20, the department did not capture any state prison deaths in 11 states or any jail deaths in 12 states in the District of Columbia. In FY21 alone, according to GAO analysis produced at our request, the department failed to identify nearly 1,000 deaths. And my assessment is the true number is likely much higher. Of those recorded, 70% of the records were incomplete, and 40% of records failed to capture the circumstances of death. The Department of Justice has failed to collect complete or accurate state and local death data for the past 2 years, and failed to report to Congress how data about deaths in custody can be used to save lives, a report required by law that is now 6 years past due, and we recently learned is not expected to be produced for another 2 years. PSI's investigation also found the department has no plans to make state and local death data public again, despite the obvious public interest in this transparency. Now, today's hearing may dive at times into arcane discussions of administrative regulations or the close parsing of legislative text, and those discussions are relevant. They are relevant. If the department has concluded in 2022, 8 years after this law was reauthorized, that it is incapable of successfully implementing it, I am surely willing to work with them to help fix that. But this hearing is about something more fundamental. Americans are needlessly dying and are being killed while in the custody of their own government. In our July hearing, focused on the federal prison system, we revealed that federal pretrial detainees have been denied proper nutrition, hygiene, and medical care, endured months of lockdowns with limited or no access to the outdoors or basic services, and had rats and roaches infesting their cells. We revealed that federal inmates killed themselves while the basic practices of suicide prevention and wellness checks were neglected. Abusive and unconstitutional practices by the federal government that likely led to loss of life in federal facilities. We revealed that the Bureau of Prisons, an agency of the Department of Justice, was warned for years by its own investigators of corruption and misconduct in its own facility and of a, quote, lack of regard for human life by its own personnel. Today, we will hear about the experiences of Americans in state and local prisons and jails, Americans entitled to constitutional rights no matter where they are incarcerated, no matter whether they are incarcerated. And we'll hear about Americans who died in custody, many of whose deaths and causes of death are not being counted by the federal government, as the federal government is bound to count them. The same federal government obligated to defend their constitutional rights. Before I yield to the ranking member, and with Ms. Maley's permission, we're going to listen to an audio clip of the last phone call that she shared with her son while he was jailed, a pretrial detainee who was never convicted of any crime. I want to warn those who are tuned in across the country that this is a disturbing clip, and while this audio plays, ask that we imagine how we might feel to be on either end of this call. Please play the audio.
Lawyers and the sheriff and all this other kind of shit trying to make it so I can come in there and see you. I'm trying also to get you out of there. Get you on. I know you are, Matthew. I'm doing everything I can to get you out until I can see you. Hello? Yeah. They're doing everything they can. And I'm looking for pain. I've got blood, my feet are swollen. It hurts so. I'm trying. 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 I'm trying I know, Matthew, I know what is wrong with you. I told you this can happen. I love you, Matthew. They're going to cut us off.
The crisis in America's prisons, jails, and detention centers is ongoing and unconscionable. The Department of Justice and the Congress must treat this as the emergency for constitutional rights that it is. Senator Johnson, I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are correct. That's very difficult to listen to. Ms. Maley, Ms. Fano, our sincere condolences for the loss of your loved ones. I can't imagine how difficult that is for you to listen to that. I think, first of all, let me just enter my prepared opening remarks into the record. Much of what I prepared would be just repeat of what the chairman has laid out. I think many people might question what equity does the federal government have in how state and local governments run their prisons. I think we just heard the equity right there. As the chairman laid out, there are issues of civil rights and basic civil liberties, the presumption of innocence, the rights to a fair trial, a speedy trial, the rights to be given proper care when in custody. So I just want to commend the chairman for doggedly pursuing the truth here. I think you're certainly experiencing the frustration I've experienced as chairman of the full committee doing investigations and simply having the departments and the agencies pretty well ignore our oversight requests. The American people deserve the truth here. The American people deserve to understand what's happening in federal government agencies. I don't know whether these things could be prevented from more rigorous federal government oversight, congressional oversight, exposure, but it's just the right thing to do. So again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your pursuit of these truths. I've certainly been appreciative of the fact that we've been able to work on this cooperatively. Specifically in terms of this issue right here, I think it is interesting. The original law passed in 2000 did produce information. I've got a report here, I think it's 40-some pages long. It's chock full of information. I know it expired, but the Department of Justice continued to provide this information to inform Congress, inform the American public. Then Congress changed the law, they updated the law, and put funding attached to it with penalties. And then something went haywire. I mean, you're talking about the exact legislative text. Which agency can collect the data versus one that can't. I mean, it's all bureaucratic BS, if you ask me, but it happened. And so we lost the transparency. And it doesn't look like the Department of Justice is particularly interested in providing that transparency now, and that's a serious issue. That's I don't understand it. But listen, I'm going to continue to cooperate with you to try and get those answers, because I think Ms. Fano, Ms. Maley, I think you deserve those answers. And hopefully some of this congressional oversight can do more than assist us in passing new laws. Hopefully it can save lives. I wish that could have been the case with your loved ones. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. The subcommittee's findings, which form the basis for today's hearing, are laid out in a bipartisan staff report, and I ask unanimous consent that this report be entered into the record. We will now call our first panel of witnesses for this afternoon's hearing. Ms. Vanessa Fano is the sister of Jonathan Fano, who died in the East Baton Rouge Parish Prison in Louisiana. Mrs. Belinda L. Maley is the mother of Matthew Laughlin, who died in the Chatham County Detention Center in Georgia. And Professor Andrea Armstrong is a professor of law at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law. The subcommittee is deeply grateful for your presence, testimony, and courage in appearing today. We look forward to your testimony. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days for any additional comments or questions by members of the subcommittee. The rules of the subcommittee require all witnesses to be sworn in. So at this time, I would ask you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. The record will reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. Your written testimonies will be printed for the record in their entirety. We ask that you try to limit your remarks to around 5 minutes. Ms. Fano, we'll hear from you first, and you're recognized for your opening remarks. Just a kind reminder to all three of you, when addressing the subcommittee, please make sure that your microphones are on as indicated by the red light. Thank you, Ms. Fano.
Thank you, Chairman Ossoff and Ranking Member Johnson, for the opportunity to testify before you today. And thank you to the committee staff whose tireless work made my appearance possible here today. No amount of time can truly heal what I share with you today. Jonathan Luis Fano is my brother. Jonathan was so kind. He felt guilty even so much as killing a bug. He once took the bus downtown just to babysit our cousin's kids, even though it was his own birthday. Jonathan would spend hours upon hours listening to my problems and would do anything to support me. But at the time he needed the same support, no one responsible for his care, custody, and control gave it to him. Jonathan suffered from bipolar disorder and depression, for which he sought professional help and support from his family. He was never any type of threat or danger to us or to others. In October 2016, Jonathan was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, while having a mental breakdown and taken to East Baton Rouge Parish Prison. In his 10 weeks in pre-trial detention, Jonathan never received a mental evaluation. After cutting his wrists, he was placed in isolation. Despite our frequent phone calls, our family was repeatedly told that Jonathan did not want to speak to us. It was only on Christmas that we heard from him. Jonathan told us he wasn't allowed to call us. During that phone call, we learned about Jonathan's attempt on his own life. We could not get the details before the for-profit phone system cut off our call. Even though we provided more funds, we weren't able to continue the call. We trusted the system. My family trusted the system when it provided us Jonathan's court date. My family flew across the country only to discover we were provided the wrong date. We trusted his public defender would be advocating for Jonathan's mental health, care, and release, and the advice to wait just a little longer in custody to resolve the case. We trusted the Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office who confirmed Jonathan was receiving the care he needed in detention. On February 2nd, 2017, Jonathan hanged himself with a bedsheet in his cell. When we finally saw his lifeless body, the first time in 10 weeks, he was handcuffed to an intensive care unit bed. It was only then we realized how wrong we were to place our trust in this system, which told us there was no fault after their own internal investigation of Jonathan's death. It is only through our own insistence over the past 5 years that we have come to learn how hard Jonathan tried to receive help, how belittled he was, how no one believed him, how so many other people have died in the same jail under the same conditions. Each time I tell Jonathan's story, he feels farther away. I worry for the day where I can't distinctly remember his voice or his warmth or even his face. I tell you Jonathan's story for every family who has experienced the same. And I hope in doing so, we can improve our beloved nation and prevent this from ever happening to another family again. Please accept my respectful request to enter further written testimony into the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fano, and the rest of your written testimony will be so entered without objection. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Maley, we'll now hear from you. Don't feel bound by the precise time on the clock. We'll accommodate the time you need to share your story, and you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ossoff and Ranking Member Johnson, for the opportunity to testify before you today. And thank you to committee staff whose work made my appearance here today possible. Mothers and sons have a special bond, a bond that no one should ever be able to break. Tragically, in my case, that bond was broken. It was broken by a for-profit medical provider that brought a painful death on my only son, my only child. My son Matthew was scared and alone in the Chatham County, Georgia Detention Center on a nonviolent drug offense. Matthew was suffering from cardiomyopathy, which the for-profit medical provider ignored. Studies show that the prognosis for people with untreated cardiomyopathy is bleak, and Matthew was never given any treatment. The for-profit medical provider had no intentions of treating him because cardiology appointments outside of the jail would cut into their profit margin. One of his jailers called his pain and anguish, quote, unquote, fussy. Matthew knew he was dying. He told me many times by phone and in a single jail visit that, quote, I needed to get him out of here, and that he didn't want to die here. The pure horror of Matthew's voice made me feel as though I was dying as well. Matthew died a slow, painful death over the course of weeks. He was too sick to take phone calls or visits after the one time I got to see him in jail. I never got to hold him, to tell him how much I loved him, or pray with him. The next time I got to see Matthew, he had already suffered brain injury after being resuscitated 3 times by the jail staff. My last visit with him was to take him off of life support, where he was still handcuffed to an ICU bed and under 24/7 supervision by a corrections officer. After 32 years of life with my only son, our bond was broken. And no one, not the health provider, not the infirmary staff, the sheriff's office, or the district attorney was willing to help. They did take time to exact one last indignity upon Matthew before his death, issuing him a personal recognizance bond after he was brain dead. So his death would not count as an in-custody death. Not a day goes by that I don't think of what Matthew went through. In closing, Matthew's story might not be over. I will continue to spread awareness of this problem for as long as I am able. With over 2 million people in our prisons and jails, there are more millions of mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends who are in this same or worse situation. This should not be ignored. That is why enforcement of the Death in Custody Act is so important and could be a tool to hold the for-profit jail and prison medical providers accountable for unnecessary deaths like Matthew's and others. I asked respectively to enter further written testimony into the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maley, and without objection, your written testimony will be so entered into the record. Ms. Fano, Ms. Maley, thank you for sharing your difficult, deeply personal stories with the subcommittee. Professor Armstrong, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to present your opening statement.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify. Thank you also to the staff who worked incredibly hard to pull this together, as well as the courage of the families who are appearing as witnesses today. My name is Andrea Armstrong, and I am a law professor at Loyola University, New Orleans. I teach in the areas of criminal and constitutional law, and I research incarceration law and policy. I have visited prisons and jails across the country, and I participate in audits of these facilities for their operations and adherence to best practices. My students and I created IncarcerationTransparency.org. It's a project and a website that collects, publishes, and analyzes deaths in custody in Louisiana prison, jails, and detention centers. At the time that we started that project, and continuing today, the type of information that we wanted was not available, namely individual-level death records, as well as facility-level death records, so that we could identify which facilities in Louisiana were actually the most troubled. As we've heard today from other witnesses, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned when a death in custody occurs. In addition to the impact on families and communities, deaths in custody may signal broader challenges in a facility. It is impossible to fix what is invisible and hidden. As Justice Brandeis wrote, sunlight is the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman. Increasing public transparency on deaths in custody is a critical step towards ultimately reducing deaths in custody. I'd like to share with you a graph that I shared with your staff, and it's on page 28 of Exhibit 1. This chart helps us understand why transparency is so critical. The percentage of suicides that happened in solitary confinement, also known as isolation, restrictive housing, or segregation, is highlighted in pink. And what you can see is we are looking at the location of suicides by the type of facility. So the first column is the Department of Corrections. Those are prisons. The second is juvenile facilities. The third is jails that are locally operated. And the fourth is private. What you can see in pink is that 43% of all suicides in Louisiana jails occurred in solitary confinement. Compare that to only 7% in our state prisons. Of the 3 youth suicides that happened between 2015 and 2019 in Louisiana, 2 out of 3 occurred when these youth were confined, alone, and in segregation. This finding should prompt review of staffing, discipline, security, and mental health protocols in the jails where the suicides occurred. But unfortunately, due to changes in the federal collection of data on deaths, we will no longer be able to identify patterns like these. That's because the Department of Justice no longer collects information on incident locations within a prison or jail. It also doesn't collect information from facilities where there were 0 deaths, meaning it will be harder for facilities to learn from each other what works and what doesn't work. Changes in what's collected is not the only problem. In addition, the Department of Justice is undercounting deaths. For deaths in 2020, Louisiana reported 6 total deaths to the Bureau of Justice Assistance. In contrast, Loyola law students identified 180 deaths in 2020 in Louisiana prisons and jails. And multiple sheriffs informed our students that they were no longer required to report deaths in custody for federal data collection. And if Louisiana's experience is similar to those of other states, 2020 will be the first year in almost 2 decades in which the Department of Justice cannot tell us who is dying behind bars and why. Congress has a range of tools available to help increase transparency, which ultimately, I hope, will reduce in-custody deaths. The work of your committee is vital, and academic researchers like myself stand ready to assist and to support as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong, and thank you again to all 3 for your powerful testimony today. I'll begin with questions, and I'd like to begin with you, Professor Armstrong. Unless Senator Padilla, do you have an imminent? Professor Armstrong, I'd like to begin with you. Explain how deaths in custody as data can be a proxy or an indicator for conditions in specific facilities.
So what we know when we look at the data is we look for patterns in what's happening, right? And so, for example, the slide that I shared on suicides, what that tells us is that there are deep differences between where suicides are occurring, which makes me want to look at the policies that are in place. So were staff doing observation rounds near the areas of segregation? Discipline. Why were people put in solitary confinement, and for what types of offenses, and for how long? Because we know of the harmful effects of solitary confinement and the ways in which that it can both create and aggravate existing serious mental illness, in many cases leading to suicide. We also want to think about what are the mental health protocols. Are they doing the required visual checks? Are they doing the suicide watch observations that are required under best practices? So deaths in that way can be the tip of the iceberg for understanding what is happening in that facility and their adherence to best practices.
And Professor, you're the founder of Incarceration Transparency. What does this organization do in a nutshell?
It's more of a project than an organization, but it's my students and I. So for the past 3 years, now about 60 students, we collect, publish, and analyze individual level records of death. But I think in terms of transparency, the goal is we have a searchable database where you can go and look up any record of death and try and understand what's happening at your local facility in particular. It's often because of this database that family members reach out to me for information about the deaths of their loved ones.
And law students making public record requests are able to capture this data, correct?
Yes, technically you don't have to be a lawyer to file a public records request, but it certainly helps. And so my students do this every single year.
And in your view, is this work that the federal government should be doing?
Absolutely. It's me and 20 law students once a year. It would be much better if the federal government collected this level of information.
And therefore, indeed, work that is eminently or should be eminently within the capacity of the United States Department of Justice.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Maley, thank you again for sharing your family's personal tragedy with the public today. I'd like to ask you, what has motivated you to take this step?
The biggest motivation, and it will serve no justice for my son, there is none. The biggest motivation I have is everyone knows or knows somebody that is affected by drug use, alcohol use, mental illness, and sometimes pure carelessness that could end you being pulled over by your local law enforcement agents and put in jail. It's a horrible thing for me to think of maybe my next door neighbor, maybe going to the store and get pulled over for something. A minor infraction, as we all know, can put you in jail and jeopardize your life. I would like some transparency. I would like to be able to know that our justice system is doing the right thing according to our health care providers in these institutions.
Thank you, Ms. Maley. Ms. Fano, thank you as well for sharing your family's story, as difficult as I can imagine it must be, and for your powerful testimony. What is your message or demand or call to action for members of this subcommittee and the Senate and for the folks of the Department of Justice?
Had adequate care been given to my brother, Jonathan Luis Fano, I do believe that I would still have him in my life. I believe that if we provide the resources that are necessary to inmates who struggle with mental illness, far less tragedies will occur. It's just a matter of acknowledging those mistakes and acknowledging that we can improve and be better so that such traumatic incidents will not occur, so that families will not have to deal with the horrible reality of, rather than a loved one coming out of an institution more well established and aware of how to integrate back into society, they come back in a casket. So I ask that we acknowledge our mistakes and move towards a better future for everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Fano. At this time, with the ranking member's permission, I'll yield to Senator Padilla for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Johnson, for the accommodation. I have another meeting in a few minutes I need to get to, but wanted to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chair, for your ongoing diligence on oversight here. And thank all three witnesses for participating. I do have a couple questions for Professor Armstrong, but wanted to begin with Ms. Fano, not only as a follow-up to the chairman's question, I guess the follow-up, and then I'll share the personal. The follow-up is, so if some of the clear recommendations were to be followed and there is more transparency and more true data sharing, how could that help you, your family, so many other families across the country that have experienced similar tragedies?
A big part in what had occurred with our family involved our trust. Consistently, we were told to do things a certain way and that things were going correctly. We did not know about how many incidents had occurred. Had we known, had we been disclosed the information of how horrendous the conditions are in that facility and how few actually received adequate care, we would have insisted upon a different outcome. A lot of our decisions came from pure trust towards our system, towards the appointed attorney that we had, as well as the staff members at that correctional facility. So, should we change that? I do believe that other families might make the right decisions, might have more acknowledgement of the potential dangers, and with that acknowledgement can come change.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And look, I know the data in front of us, the report that's being discussed, spans, from jails and folks that are pretrial to prisons, folks that have been convicted of a wide range of crimes, short sentences, long sentences, and everything in between. But that does nothing to take away fundamental human rights. I mentioned a minute ago that there's just a couple of personal comments I wanted to share, and it begins with applauding you for being so forthcoming on concern about mental health and mental health conditions. My wife's a mental health advocate. Our family's big on making sure we're undoing stigma and raising awareness. It's one thing to talk about in the PTSD in the military context, another when it comes to, mothers suffering from postpartum depression, or in the higher education space, right? Stress on college campuses, and across the board, mental health is a big concern. Prior to the pandemic, we've all experienced a huge uptick during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's important to recognize that whether it's jails, prisons, other institutions are no exception to that. And again, I come back to the human rights people deserve in terms of access to care, quality of care, and truth. So the other piece, you grew up not too far from where I grew up, very similar communities. So your story resonates, and I appreciate your courage to be here and to share. Professor Armstrong, following up on some of your work and some of the testimony you've submitted, in 2020, Reuters completed an investigation into how an estimated 5,000 people died in jails throughout the country in a single year. And that's jails. It's not counting prisons. So these people died without ever having their case even heard at trial. The data is sadly clear and compelling. The U.S. correctional system occupies a space where class, race, gender, and a host of other factors influence how long or how demanding your time in custody will be. However, pre-trial time spent in a correctional facility should never be a de facto death sentence. So I noticed that in your written testimony, and I'll quote, "A lack of transparency on deaths in custody undermines our nation's commitment to public safety." Could you walk through the subcommittee through how a detailed accounting of deaths in custody would better inform our policymaking here in Congress?
Absolutely. So first, the nationwide data from 2000 to 2019 shows that 20% of deaths in custody were actually of people facing charges, meaning they had never had a trial. In Louisiana, that was 14% of our deaths were pretrial. But think about it this way. If community members don't trust the policing, the sheriffs, the facilities, right, and the fact that our system is capable of delivering justice, they are less likely to report crime. They are less likely to serve as a witness or to provide testimony in a criminal trial. And they are less likely to themselves feel protected by those same systems when they are a victim of trial. And so public trust in our criminal justice institutions is fundamental. When we see the death penalty exacted without a judicial sentence, and where a person's range their probability of death is simply a factor of which facility they are assigned to, that undermines their trust and it undermines all of our safety.
Thank you. And just a final question. In your written testimony, again, you listed a number of suggested amendments that you believe could be useful for better collecting data. So it's one thing to share data, but if you're not even collecting it on the front end, that's another issue. Among the suggestions you made is that the Bureau of Justice Assistance collect information on incarcerated people's specific medical illnesses and pre-existing conditions. Did you mean to include mental health conditions as well? And just briefly elaborate on that.
So what we know from from BJS, right, so the earlier data, is they actually did collect mental health observation and practices, medical illnesses as well, although they only asked pre-existing conditions for medical conditions. They did not ask for mental health. So when I proposed reverting back to those categories that we used to collect data on, that would include mental health as well as medical health.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Ms. Fano, Ms. Maley, our sincere condolences, and I can't imagine how painful it is for you to have to relive this. I can't imagine losing a child or a sibling. So again, thank you. I want to try and find out, because it sounds in both of your cases, you were certainly not given the kind of contact you'd want with a loved one in trouble. You're pretty well blocked out. So let's start there. While your brother were alive, how many times were you able to see them or talk to them? We'll start with Ms. Fano. Approximately, I'm not.
Of course.
Once.
Sorry. What I had meant to say was the only occasion where we were able to get a phone call through to my brother after multiple attempts from multiple phone numbers, as my father, mother, siblings, myself had made attempts throughout the weeks. Most likely every other day, essentially, we would call and be told he did not want to call us. It was on Christmas. That was the only time that we ever received a phone call, and it was not even longer than 2 minutes.
His total time in custody was how long?
The total time in custody was from, can I just review?
Again, just approximately.
91 days.
91 days. So you believe he did want to talk to you, though?
He had stated that he wanted to call.
So your belief is prison officials just simply lying to you?
My brother had stated he had made attempts.
Okay.
And he had also written one letter to us where he had stated that he wasn't allowed to call us and he wanted to talk to us.
Ms. Maley, what about in your case? How long was your son in custody? And how many times, and you obviously knew, when he went into custody, he was already had this health condition, correct?
I'm going to assume so because cardiomyopathy doesn't happen overnight. It's a condition that alcoholics and drug addicts get because of the wear and tear on your heart, your vascular system.
Right.
So with what I know and what I have investigated, that untreated cardiomyopathy can advance rapidly. There are medications which, I mean, it's not funny and I'm shaking my head because it's just unbelievable. It's also due to a fluid buildup. And people with heart issues and fluid retention issues are given a diuretic.
Right.
And
Your son should be alive today, but again, were you aware of this condition when he went into custody?
no,
Okay, so this is something that developed while he was in custody?
yes,
How many times were you able to see him or talk to him while he was in custody?
one time.
One
I
time.
got
And
to
this over
see
the span
him.
of how long again?
2.5 months.
2.5 months. So now, following the death of your son and your brother, who were you able to talk to within the prison system, within government? What conversations have you had? And I'll go back to Ms. Vano. You or your family members. I mean,
So my mother and sister had actually been able to see him one time, and they had talked to the front desk staff. So I'm not quite sure the exact names for those individuals. Following when he hung himself, we were in contact with numerous members from the facility as they had to follow through with an investigation. I'm not quite sure the exact names of all of those individuals, as my focus at the time was more of my brother rather than retaining those names. But we were in contact with those individuals following him hanging himself. The most consistent contact we did have with that facility was after he had done that.
do you feel they gave you information? Did they give you answers to what happened? Let me cut to the chase. Did they show compassion?
No.
So you didn't get any information? That was pretty well...
They had called us because we are in LA. They had an LAPD officer come, and the LAPD officer had a phone with him, and the other individual on the other line only spoke English. My mother speaks Spanish. He bluntly stated, "Your brother hung himself." And I asked him, "Is he going to be all right?" And he said, "You have to get here." He most likely isn't. And I asked for more details, but he stated they were going under investigation at this time. When we arrived, my mother and I were the first to arrive, and there was all friends, no compassion whatsoever. The individual who was guarding him had no compassion. The staff member who led us to the facility had no compassion, just presented us to his body connected to multiple wires and machines that assured he could still function bodily-wise. They had stated that only his brainstem was functional due to how long he had hung himself and how little oxygen his brain had received. Every other part of him, every bit of him that would retain memory, that was him essentially, was no longer present.
Liz, I'm sorry to be asking you to relive this. I really am. I wish I didn't have to do this. Following that horrible day, did you have further conversations with any officials, or was that pretty much your last contact?
We had stayed a few days as We were waiting for MRI results, so they were in a bit of contact with us. There was always a security by his bedside. He was handcuffed to the bed despite the results of him being brain dead. And at the time of passing, a staff member had to be in the room with us to assure he did die. I do believe that we had to even wait for him to come, even though we were all present and ready. We had to wait for him. Following this, we received a call. I'm unsure of how many days, or maybe if it was a few weeks, but we received a call stating that they had found that there was nothing that went wrong, that the investigation was just about clear. They did nothing wrong with his case. Following this, my family and I couldn't quite accept this, and we sought for more information and investigation in our own means. But the last real statement that they said to us was that they did nothing wrong.
They played it by the book.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to continue this for reluctantly? Ms. Maley, have you talked to authorities following the passing of your son?
No.
No authorities whatsoever?
No, sir.
Nobody reached out to you?
No, sir.
Have you tried to contact people?
No, sir. No. No. They ignored our phone calls. The only person that talked to us was before he passed. The only person that told us anything, and very little of that, was the man that worked for the healthcare. And I would call there every day, maybe twice a day, to check on him. And his only response was, he's got 24-hour care and he's doing fine.
Tried to reassure you.
Excuse me?
Tried to reassure you, basically.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Which now I know that that was not true.
So again, no expression of sympathy, no
No,
demonstration of any compassion whatsoever in either one of your cases?
No, sir.
No. I don't have any further questions right now.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. In part, Ms. Fano and Ms. Maley, I think that the subcommittee should help, insofar as we can, to honor and to remember Jonathan and Matthew. And their lives are having an impact here today that I hope the ranking member and I will work together to ensure results in change. In remembering and honoring their lives, Ms. Fano, can you just tell us a little bit more about Jonathan, what he was like, what he loved, how he lived?
Jonathan was my older brother, and with that, he was very protective of me. Anytime I had problems, he would talk to me about things and give me tips and tricks and how to go about school projects and how to make new friends even. We used to play silly little video games together. I would always get stuck in certain bosses, and he'd always jump in and help me, and he used to be so into Marvel and DC, and even now I think of all of these amazing things that he never got to witness, that he even said he wanted to. He wanted to see adaptions of different comics that he liked. He was incredibly, incredibly empathetic towards other people and animals even. He was vegetarian for a good portion of his life. He didn't like the concept of eating an animal even so much. But even with that, he would still, for us who weren't vegetarian, make us food and assure that we were eating properly. And he was just the glue that held us together. And even when we were frustrated at each other, he would attempt at keeping peace when he could. And now we know that there's a hole missing. And nothing will ever properly fill that hole again. But that was the kind of person that he was. And even despite his mental illness, he had a story, he had a life, he had a home. And he had wanted so badly to come home. Because we were a family, and he loved his family. And over again, I told him when I was younger how one of my biggest fears was losing him. And he promised me over and over that we're family, and he wouldn't leave. But now, rather than Vanessa and Jonathan, it's just me. And I'm here because of him and his legacy.
And Ms. Fano, how old were you when all this happened?
I was still in college. It was happening during finals. That was one of the reasons I wasn't able to see him that last time. And I regret it. Because I didn't think it was going to be my last chance to see him. I believe I was 19 at the time, as it was 5 years ago.
And Ms. Fano, you mentioned that your mother didn't speak English, so you were translating for your family 19 years old throughout this ordeal. Is that right?
I was the one that had to tell her because she couldn't understand what he was saying. And so I had to tell her that Jonathan hung himself and that he wasn't going to be okay because she kept asking, but like, is he going to get better? What are they saying? And I had to explain to her that he wasn't. And that when we were going to get there, he wasn't going to be well. And I had to explain when we arrived, because even then, they didn't have anyone on staff or tried to bring anyone on staff that could speak Spanish. Essentially, through that time, it was just us having to translate things about his condition, about his state, about what happened. And I remember her asking, what do you mean? Like, he hung himself for that long and they didn't know? How do they not know?
Thank you, Ms. Fano. Ms. Maley, would you be willing to share a few words about Matthew?
Of course. I was very proud of my son, and he was my heart. Growing up, he was rambunctious, amazed by things, involved. He was raised in the church. He participated in the church. He loved working on cars. He was involved in car shows. He liked camping and water skiing and traveling. And Matthew was not perfect by any means. He was a drug addict. I tried to get him help, and for that there was help, but Matthew was unwilling just for some reason he found it easier, or maybe he had mental illness that brought that on. But in saying that, we all know people that have got problems. And you're there for them unconditionally. And I would have given my life for him. I begged God to take me instead of my son. He had a lot to offer. He had, like Vanessa's brother and Linda's son, he never met the love of his life. He never had children. There were so many things that he's never going to experience in his life. I look at my friends and I'm jealous of what they have and what I could have had and what Matthew could have had. But he made poor choices, and the choices that he made, I have to live with. And it's the most difficult thing that a person can go through. I'm lost without him. I have pictures. I lost all my voicemails from him, so the shock of listening to his voice again, in the worst way possible, is just pretty much too much.
Ms. Maley, thank you for honoring him with your testimony today. Professor.
Thank you.
You study policy. You study statistics. This isn't about statistics. The statistics, well collected and analyzed, can be a tool to save lives, to spare other parents and brothers and sisters this agony. So I'd like for you, please, to reflect on that. Share why you believe it is so essential for the federal government to fix this.
So I think the first part is one of the things that we do in addition to collecting these records is we try to do something of what y'all are doing here today. We memorialize the lives of people who died in the New Orleans jail without talking necessarily about their death, but understanding, for public understanding of who these people are. And they were overwhelmingly Saints fans. They were poets, they were football players, they had job opportunities. And it's important to recognize what we as a community lose, all of us lose, when people die in custody. The other part of this that is important in terms of the federal data collection is both of these deaths that we're talking about today happened in jails. Jails, there's over, we think about 3,000 of them, and I've yet to see an exact list of every jail that we have in this country, and they report only to themselves. The federal government has unique authority to be able to collect this information from the jails in ways that members of the community cannot. Because they're so spread out, because they're all individual fiefdoms, doing their own rules, their own policies, their own practices, which may differ from facility to facility, it is the unique power of the federal government to be able to collect that information. And jails are where the conditions of incarceration are most hidden from our communities.
And is it fair to say, Professor, that generally speaking, for each death, there is more suffering, more illness, perhaps poorly treated, more folks inside in agony.
Yes, I mean, I think the suffering that we are all experiencing today by honoring the lives lost is not just the families, it's not just the people. I am also reminded that we have large numbers and members of our community who work in these facilities, who witness these traumatic incidents because that is their employment. They too are traumatized. Other incarcerated people often witness these deaths. They may be the ones who first report it, who sound the alarm, who bang on the steel door to alert somebody that the person next to them or in their cell is also dead. That is also continuing trauma that accrues. So I would suggest that the harm to the families is enormous, but it is actually a harm that we all suffer as a community and as a society.
Ms. Fano, before your brother was jailed, did you know anything about East Baton Rouge Parish Prison, the jail?
No, we didn't know.
Well, Reuters, the news organization, conducted a study of jail deaths over the last decade. And they found that from 2009 to 2019, there were 45 deaths in that facility, an average of 4.5 per year, more than double the national average. Do you think that's information that should be made public and transparent?
Yes, absolutely.
Ms. Maley, the same news organization, Reuters, in the same study, found that 22 people over the same period died in custody at Chatham County Detention Center in our home state of Georgia, and that 50% of those deaths were due to illness. Now, we know from your son's story that deaths due to illness can also be deaths due to illness untreated or poorly treated or neglected. Do you believe that is the kind of information that should be made public, transparently?
Yes.
Ranking Member Johnson, do you have any further questions?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. Professor Armstrong,
Sir.
you say you have 20 students, and you do this over, how many man-hours do you put into what report you generate?
I can't even count them. I mean,
Is it over the course of a week or 2 weeks or the entire semester? Or?
So for every fall semester, I have approximately 20 students. This semester I have 23. This is a semester-long project because they file the public records requests, but often there is not a response under the public records law of Louisiana. So they have to constantly go after these facilities by email, by phone call, sometimes driving there to get them.
We understand the process.
Sorry.
Do you do this just you focus on one state, one county, what are you doing here?
We only do it in the state of Louisiana,
Okay.
and we do every single detention facility in the state that we are aware of.
So whenever anybody dies, there's a coroner report, there's a death report, there's something. Is that what you're doing your FOIAs on?
No. So the jails have to report to the local coroner, but unless you know to file the public records request for that, that's difficult to get, one. And two, when we do file public records requests on coroners, they often don't categorize them as in-custody deaths, so they're difficult for the coroner themselves to identify and then respond. What we do is that we file directly with the administrator of that facility, and what we ask for is the information that they reported to the federal government.
So have you seen the 2002-2019 It's got a lot of statistics to it.
Yeah.
You know, I think what we really do need is we need those individual death reports that show what actually happened. We're talking, I think at most, did you say 3,000? Well, Senator Padilla said 5,000 deaths per year. Now, you know, within a population of 1.5 million people, I mean, there will be just deaths of natural causes and that type of thing. So you're probably talking about a universe of a couple thousand deaths that you're really researching here, deaths in custody, correct?
That's correct. About 200 deaths per year is what we find in Louisiana.
In Louisiana, but I'm talking about nationally now. And the reason I'm asking how many man-hours you put into this, obviously I'm a data-driven kind of guy, being an accountant. You know, it's like, got to solve problems. You have to understand what the information is and how difficult it is to gather. I wouldn't think for the Department of Justice it has, anybody know how many employees it's got? It's quite a few. Okay, you could have put a couple folks doing this, you know, and obviously we gave them resources to do this. It wouldn't be that difficult to literally gather the death reports on a couple thousand individuals, and if they're not getting it, if they start doing this in the year 2000, they'll start refining the process. They'll say, okay, this isn't working, or we're not getting from that state. So, you know, to this day, we don't have, how many states didn't report? And we don't know which states. The Department of Justice won't tell us which states they didn't get information from. And go figure. What is that, a national security issue? So the point I'm trying to make here is, I think, together with all of you and the chairman, this is important information to have. It really shouldn't be that difficult to gather, you know, particularly when you've been at it for 22 years. There was a break. Again, the next panel will analyze why this break occurred, quite honestly, how ridiculous it is that it did occur, and why the ball was dropped here. But, I mean, Mr. Chairman, I think I've kind of got what I need from Professor Armstrong to move on to the next panel. But again, I just want to close with just my sincere condolences, my sincere thanks for sharing your tragic stories with us. It's important. We need to know these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. And Ms. Fano, Ms. Maley, on behalf of the whole subcommittee, please accept our gratitude for your presence, your courage, our condolences for your loss, the loss that your families have suffered. So appreciative of the extraordinarily open and honest conversation that we've had today, as you've helped to support our efforts to bring compassion and accountability and respect for human life into public policy. Please know that Jonathan and Matthew are having a tremendous impact here in this room today. And on behalf of the staff and the members of the subcommittee, we will continue working to ensure that that impact is magnified through change. Professor, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today and for your ongoing work to bring transparency and accountability to this system. It's deeply appreciated. That'll conclude the first panel, and witnesses are excused with the subcommittee's gratitude. The subcommittee will take a brief recess as we prepare for a second panel. The committee will now call our second panel of witnesses for this afternoon's hearing. Ms. Maureen A. Henneberg serves as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Operations and Management in the Office of Justice Programs for the U.S. Department of Justice. And Dr. Greta L. Goodwin serves as Director of Homeland Security and Justice for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. It is the custom of the subcommittee to swear in all witnesses, so at this time I would ask you to please stand and raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may return to your seats. We'll be using a timing system today. Your written testimonies in their entirety will be printed in the record. We would ask that you try to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Ms. Henneberg, we'll hear from you first. Thank you. You may proceed. You'll need to turn that microphone on, Ms. Henneberg. Thank you.
Is it on now? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ossoff, and thank you, Ranking Member Johnson and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today about our work at the Department of Justice to implement the Death in Custody Reporting Act, or DCRA, and the ways we work with our state, local, and tribal partners to improve the conditions of incarceration. We believe that gathering data about deaths in custody is a noble and necessary step towards a transparent and legitimate justice system. There is no more solemn responsibility than the protection of life, and DCRA is designed to help us obtain information we need to assist state and federal authorities in fulfilling this responsibility. Since the original statute was enacted more than 2 decades ago, the Department of Justice, through its Office of Justice Programs, has worked hard to collect data on deaths in prisons and jails and during arrest. As I know this committee appreciates, it is a major undertaking to gather this information from 56 states and territories, who in turn rely on reports from thousands of prisons, local jails, and law enforcement agencies. But we firmly believe that it is well worth the effort. While the need for DCRA reporting is unquestioned by the department, the current process deserves to be reevaluated. For many years following DCRA's enactment in 2000, our Bureau of Justice Statistics collected data called for by DCRA, which it continued to do even after the law expired 6 years later. All told, BJS has published 40 reports on the topic, which we have provided a wealth of information on causes of death and characteristics of the facilities where the deaths occurred. Then, in 2013, an update to DCRA was introduced. Signed into law the following year, the new law expanded the original DCRA. It mandated reporting by federal law enforcement agencies. It added a study requirement focused on using the data to identify ways to reduce deaths in custody. Perhaps of greatest consequence, it gave the Attorney General the discretion to reduce funding to non-compliant states under the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grants Program. Through the JAG program, OJP provides over $273 million annually in funding for general purposes, law enforcement, and criminal justice activities throughout the nation. This last requirement posed a dilemma. As a federal statistical agency, BJS is prohibited from using its data for any purpose other than statistics or research. Though DCRA of 2013 was well-intentioned, it had unintended negative consequences for the state and local collections. For one, since DCRA currently requires the department to receive all information centrally from states, we can no longer collect data directly from state and local agencies as we once did. Second, the penalty provided under DCRA of 2013 actually has the potential to punish states and local agencies that comply with the law. If, for example, local agencies decline to report to their state, that state's reporting to the department will be incomplete. Even though that state may submit all of the data it actually received, it could still suffer the funding penalty. Furthermore, since these grants pass through states to local jurisdictions, even the local agencies that fully report their information would feel the effects of a penalty applied in their state. Finally, we can no longer assign the collection to BJS, which had achieved a nearly 100% response rate while it administered the program. We are working hard to achieve more comprehensive reporting from states. We continue to provide training and assistance to states to improve reporting, and we are developing new methods for assessing state compliance and providing feedback to help improve reporting. In the meantime, we look to Congress to help us programmatically improve the quality and completeness of data, and we have a proposal for how to do that. For instance, we are asking to collect data directly from local agencies and open sources and enable us to restrict the funding penalty to non-compliant agencies instead of applying it statewide. We are also proposing a new grant program to help better equip agencies across the country to collect and report on deaths in custody. The Death in Custody Reporting Act is one of the many vital tools in restoring the full integrity of our justice system. The department provides tens of millions of dollars in resources to states, local communities, and tribes to improve the way incarcerated people are treated and to support efforts to reduce arrest-related deaths through law enforcement training and programs focused on building law enforcement and community trust. Examples of OJP's work are provided in my written testimony. We look forward to working with all of you to meet these challenges. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. Dr. Goodwin, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Chair Ossoff and Ranking Member Johnson, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the actions DOJ has taken to address the data collection and reporting requirements in the Death in Custody Reporting Act of 2013, DCRA, and the extent to which DOJ has studied and used the data collected from states. As already discussed, DCRA was enacted in 2014 to encourage the study and reporting of deaths in custody. Federal agencies and states that receive certain federal funding are required to report this information to DOJ. DOJ is to study the federal and state data, examine how the information can be used to reduce deaths in custody, and report its findings to the Congress. In 2015, DOJ began collecting data on the deaths of people in the custody of federal law enforcement. As of fiscal year 2020, DOJ reported 2,700 deaths in federal custody. While the agency collects the same information at the state and local level, it is not actually reported on these deaths. DOJ began collecting information from states on death in custody about 3 years ago. Agency officials told us they plan to continue collecting state data, but they have not said whether or how they will use the information to address deaths in custody. DOJ cites missing and/or incomplete data from states as one of the reasons why they have not studied the state information. We found similar concerns when we examined the data. For example, of the 47 states that submitted data, only 2 submitted all the required information. Some states did not account for all deaths in custody. Using publicly available reports, we identified nearly 1,000 deaths that occurred during fiscal year 2021 that states did not report to DOJ. 4 states did not report any deaths, yet we found that at least 124 deaths had occurred in those states. DOJ has noted that it is a top priority to improve the quality and completeness of state reporting. In 2016, the agency acknowledged that determining state compliance with DCRA would help improve the quality of the data, and they have a goal to help ensure states comply with DCRA. However, as of this month, September 2022, DOJ still has not determined whether states have complied. While DOJ collects data from states, DCRA does not require DOJ to publish state data, and the agency has no plans to do so. Importantly, after DOJ's DCRA data collection efforts began, it discontinued a long-standing program that collected and published data on deaths of people in state and local correctional institutions, the Mortality in Correctional Institutions Program. DOJ had used these data to publish reports and provide statistical information on deaths in correctional institutions. This published information allowed Congress, researchers, and the public to view and study the data. While the Mortality in Correctional Institutions report was made publicly available, the DCRA report may not be available to the public. This lack of transparency would be a great loss in the public's understanding of deaths in custody. Given that 1.5 million people were incarcerated in state prisons and local jails at the end of 2020, statistics on deaths in custody are a valuable resource for understanding mortality in the criminal justice system. DOJ has made some progress toward addressing what it calls a profoundly important issue, but significant work remains. Because right now, DOJ and states are expending resources to compile a national data set that may not be studied or published, potentially missing an opportunity to inform practices to help reduce deaths in custody. We are encouraging Congress to consider whether DCRA should be amended to ensure that DOJ uses the data it collects from states for recurring study and reporting to Congress and the public, and To help enhance the quality of the data, we are recommending that DOJ develop a plan to determine state compliance with DICRA. Chair Ossoff and Ranking Member Johnson, this concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin and Ms. Henneberg, for your opening remarks and for your presence here today. I want to begin, Dr. Goodwin, just by making sure that it's clear what you've found. I think in some ways the most powerful and alarming piece of data that you and your team unearthed at the request of the subcommittee is that in 2021, you found nearly 1,000 deaths in state or local facilities that the department did not capture, and you found them through a review of open sources. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. So the way that 1,000 deaths kind of breaks out, and actually it's 990, but we say nearly 1,000. So the way that breaks out is like 341 of those deaths that we discovered were in state correctional facilities. And so how did we get there? So we basically use publicly available data. Some states will, when they're doing their annual statistical reporting, they provide that information. So we went through and did, as thorough of an analysis as we could to get to the 341. Then the remaining deaths, the 649 deaths, again, we use publicly available data, and we use a couple of databases that collect information on deaths that happen when someone is placed under arrest or when a death happens in custody. And so that's how we arrived at the nearly 1,000 deaths. So, but for the most part, a lot of this was publicly available data. One more thing I forgot to add. So for the 341 deaths, it was publicly available data, and we had access to some of the DICRA records, and we went through and tried to do some matching.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. Nearly 1,000 deaths uncounted last year alone. Ms. Henneberg, I do want to, first of all, just point out, this is not a political or a partisan issue. The cascade, the debacle, the decline in the department's ability to collect and produce high-integrity data has unfolded over several years and multiple administrations. This is not a partisan issue. And we appreciate your presence here today to help us sort through these issues. You've been working at the Office of Justice Programs for 20 years and leading operations and management for the past 7, correct?
I have been at the Office of Justice Programs for 32 years. I have been part of the leadership team since February of 2014 as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Operations and Management, overseeing our business offices. Correct.
Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. And your office is responsible for the implementation of DICRA, correct?
The Office of Justice Programs, our Bureau of Justice Assistance at this time is overseeing the reporting from the states. That's correct.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Henneberg. And as we've discussed, 1.5 million people are incarcerated in state prisons or local jails. Thousands die every year. Why is it important, in brief, please, for the department to study and report on deaths in custody?
The department shares your goals, Chairman Ossoff, to improve the data that's being reported, the accuracy, the quality, the completeness of the data. This data is extremely important. It's critical to understanding deaths in custody, understanding the relationship between the deaths in custody and the policies and practices of state, jail, law enforcement agencies.
I agree, Ms. Henneberg. Here are some quotes from bipartisan members of Congress, representatives and senators, about the purpose of DICRA. It would bring, quote, a new level of accountability to our nation's correctional institutions. It would, quote, provide openness in government. It would, quote, bolster public confidence and trust in our judicial system. It would, quote, bring additional transparency. Do you agree that these are among the purposes of this data collection?
The department agrees that there is critical value in all of these data to collect the data from the states, to analyze the data, to present findings so that we can better understand deaths in custody, so we can determine whether there's strategies to reduce deaths in custody.
Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, a component agency within the Office of Justice Programs, and those who are tuned in across the country will have to indulge and tolerate some acronym chaos here, but the Bureau of Justice Assistance started collecting state and local death data in 2019. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, which had previously collected this data, in fact, for 2 decades collected this data with success, analyzed the data that the Bureau of Justice Assistance collected in 2020 and produced a report in May of 2021. It identified some significant issues: that BJA did not capture any state or prison deaths in 11 states, or any jail deaths in 12 states and the District of Columbia; that from October to December of 2019, BJA missed at least 592 deaths. Were these results concerning to the Department of Justice?
The Department of Justice, over the 2-3 years that we have been collecting the data, we have seen the underreporting from states. Under DICRA 2013, states are having to collect data from their local agencies, and they are centrally reporting to BJA. The states are reporting great challenges. I think GAO's report will show this, and we've heard the same thing from our states. The states have no leverage to compel their local agencies to report the data.
Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. I appreciate your perspective on that state-local issue. My question is a specific one, if you will, please. When BJS, your statistical office, having reviewed the first quarter of collection undertaken by BJA, reported to OMB and to the department that BJA had missed state prison deaths in 11 states, jail deaths in 12 states, that from October to December of that first period when BJA was undertaking this collection that had missed 592 deaths, was that concerning? Surely that was concerning. You were transitioning from one agency to another. The prior agency was telling you it's not working. Was that concerning?
It's very concerning that there is the underreporting, and it's widespread across all the states. It's not just in certain areas.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. It was concerning. So in response to those findings by BJS, what did the Department of Justice do to repair and improve its data collection methodology so those problems wouldn't persist?
The current administration, the current department, we're focusing on fixing the problems that we have and the obstacles that we have observed with reporting under DICRA 2013. We are presenting legislative proposals to amend DICRA so that we can address issues that we believe are contributing to the underreporting. Having states serve as the central repository and the central reporter is certainly contributing.
Ms. Henneberg, you'll have to forgive me, but we are trying to understand with precision what unfolded within the department that led to a significant decline in the integrity of the data that the department was collecting. And so I'm looking for a precise answer to a very particular question. In the first few months when BJA took this over from BJS continued collecting, and then they compared data sets. And BJS, your statisticians, your folks who specialize in this, they raised a big red flag. They said, what BJA is doing is not working. My question is, in response to that specific information, that warning, what action was taken to improve BJA's methodology? Not generally, not broadly, not legislative fixes that are being sought now. What action was taken then?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important that to describe when BJS was collecting the data, they were able to go directly to local agencies, local correctional institutes, jails, and collect that data. Under DICRA 2013, BJA is presented with working with the states as central reporters, which is a significant contributor to the underreporting and the incomplete data. BJA has worked with a training and TTA provider, providing direct technical assistance to the states to review their data that is coming in, identifying ways they can improve it. We have provided trainings to the states. We have provided one-on-one technical assistance with the states to help them think through their data collection strategies, to identify areas where there is underreporting so that we can
Ms. Hennenberg, we don't have unlimited time here, and I'm not getting a precise answer to that question. I'll have to circle back. I'm going to yield now to Ranking Member Johnson, and I'll return for a second round in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hennenberg, could you bring your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth? So I want to know how many people are working on this within the Department of Justice?
Our Bureau of Justice Assistance is a grant-making agency, so their primary function is grant-making. They have staff.
Okay. How many people are working on providing this data? How many people? Is it 10? Is it 3 dozen? I mean, how many people?
I do not know the answer. I will go back and we can look at how many people are working.
Okay, so I want to know how many people were working in the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and then I want to know how many people in the assistance, okay? Want to know how many people. Ms. Goodwin, when you say you got publicly available records, what are you talking about there? Are you talking about death certificates? Are you talking about reports that states and local governments just publish and you just were able to tap into those things?
I will say, Senator, it's a little bit of both. So for some states, when they report their deaths, that information shows up in like an end-of-the-year annual statistical supplement. So we went through those states, and we basically did a Google search to see what we could find.
Okay, so how many people did you have GAO take a look at this?
2.
You had 2 people over what length of time?
From May to September. May 2022 to September 2022.
Okay, so was that about 5 months?
Yeah.
I'd have to do my fingers. But so you had 2 people, and with 2 people working for a few months, you determined that we were missing close to 1,000 death reports because you were able to find them just with open source reporting, basically.
That's correct. A lot of it was open source reporting, a lot of it, publicly available data, and some of the databases that do collect this information, the non-DOJ databases that would collect.
So do either you know approximately how many deaths occur in custody within state and local jails every year?
Unfortunately, we do not. And
I mean, just ballpark. I'm not looking precise right now. I'm just talking about ballpark. I mean, is it a couple thousand?
BJS says 2019, there were in local jails, there was 1,200 deaths.
I got that local. What about state?
State and federal was about 4,200.
So why do you combine state and federal and not state and local? I mean, it's not a trick question. It's a question. It's a curiosity. Because we normally separate federal, and then you got state and local. You did the other way. Why?
Well, local jails is a different type of facility than federal and state prison.
But isn't state prison different than federal prison?
Correct.
So so you probably got a couple thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 prisoners dying in custody in state and local prisons. I thought it was interesting as I was going through here. I just assumed this was going to be state and local, but it kept saying local, and it's only local. Why did you issue this report, chock full of information, by the way, statistics, on only local? Why don't you combine it with state?
I'm sorry, Senator Johnson, what report are you referring
to? Well, again, the whole purpose of DICRA is to determine the deaths in custody in state and local jails, correct?
Correct.
Correct? Mm-hmm. So when you publish a paper on deaths, mortality 2019, why did you only do local? Why didn't you do state and local? Because that was the whole purpose of DICRA.
In 2019, BJS did publish state and federal deaths.
Okay, but just weird combination. Okay. I think my point throughout here is that we're talking about a pretty manageable amount of information here with just a little bit of dedication from bureaucracy. Now I have it of 117,000 people in the Department of Justice. A bill that was passed in 2000 and then reauthorized in 2013. So obviously you realize Congress wanted this information. You were collecting some of it, and then you kind of stopped. I mean, I heard the explanation that when Congress passed the reauthorization, they tied it to funding, and there's a penalty there, so all of a sudden the Bureau of Justice Statistics could no longer handle that because they're, okay, I mean, that's bureaucratic impediments, I got that. But it wouldn't seem like it'd be that big a heavy lift to have the one or two people. We'll find out. I mean, I really do want to know how many people in BJS were working on providing this information, and then how many people in BJA were charged with that. You would have thought a meeting or two, you could have combined your efforts and said, you know, this is what we did, and you ought to do the same thing, which is what the question the chairman was trying to get at. Where was the breakdown here? So I'll ask you, where was the breakdown? Because it seems like BJS was able to collect this information, and all of a sudden, for whatever bureaucratic impediment, they had to turn that over to BJA. What was so hard about a pretty smooth handoff?
This department is focused on fixing and improving the data collection. So we are focused on how we can improve this.
You've been focusing on how many years? You've utterly failed. I mean, literally, you've utterly failed. This isn't that hard. GAO, 2 people over a few months got us better statistics than the Department of Justice did for how many years? We don't even know what states weren't reporting, the state and local, the 11 and 12. We weren't even able to answer that question from staff. What is the impediment to getting information from states? You got 50 states, you get a couple people, put them on it full time, they start talking to these states. You go, well, this information is missing. Over the course of 22 years, I would have thought this information gathering process would have been pretty well honed, and these reports would have just been automatic. You probably could have put one person on it, part-time. But so my point, what is wrong with bureaucracies? Why can't they accomplish just the simplest of tasks? And why won't you be transparent and honest with why you're not able to do it? I guess I'm not asking for answers to these things, just rhetorical questions, but do you have any response?
Senator Johnson, I do. The response that I gave in my oral statement and that I've tried to reiterate here is that DCRA 2013 provides for a different reporting structure. That reporting structure has left the states with little to no leverage or incentive to get the information from local agencies and law enforcement agencies. We are working with...
I thought, didn't they actually increase the incentives? They attached funding to it, and there was a penalty of not receiving funding if they didn't get... I mean, I don't think they had incentives in 2000. I think that was part of the issue with reauthorization, wasn't it? They actually put penalties to it. But it seems like they were far more successful with the prior law.
The JAG penalties that are currently in DCRA 2013 have unintended consequences. If a state is reporting everything that they are receiving from local agencies and it is incomplete, they would potentially be found in noncompliance, and their state funding would be cut, even though they would be working in good faith to.
So I will say it doesn't surprise me that Congress might have kind of screwed something up here. Okay, And we may be able to take a look at that, but we need to fully understand it first, exactly what happened, So how are we collecting it under BJS? How are we collecting under BJA? We need transparency, we need some help. This should not be that difficult to get this answer. This should not be that difficult to fix. To start getting the death reports, and quite honestly, I would want more information. I mean, I want the stories. By the way, were you listening to our witnesses in the first panel?
I was not able to join the hearing, but I did look at the victim list, and those are very heartbreaking stories.
So what I would suggest you do is you go back to the Department of Justice and you have anybody involved in this process get a clip of the testimony, and I think that just might incentivize you to get on this case and get this information. Okay?
Senator, we are proposing fixes, legislative changes to DICRA 2013 so that the department can be in a better position and have the ability to...
Listen, I come from the private sector. I had this fixed in about 10 minutes, okay? But it's taken you years is beyond comprehension, quite honestly, okay? But we're going to have to do it the government way, I guess, but we ought to get to the bottom of this, okay? Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. Dr. Goodwin, why is it important to have a full and accurate accounting of death and custody data?
So, Senator, I'll hearken back to the previous panel where you asked them, and I'd like to add on to the conversation. When we think about collecting these types of statistics, there are people at the end of these statistics. They're not just numbers. We're talking about people, and we're talking about people and their families. Collecting this information is useful to policymakers. First, it's useful to DOJ to help them better understand, like, what's happening that might be causing these deaths, what modifications might need to be made, what changes might need to be made, is there training, what needs to happen in the correctional institutions to ensure that there aren't any deaths. And then once that happens, informing the policymakers, what needs to happen, if there need to be a change in policy, what needs to happen to ensure that these deaths don't keep occurring.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. And according to your analysis of DOJ's data from last year, we already discussed nearly 1,000 deaths that your team was able to identify through open sources, uncounted in the DOJ data. Is it also the case, my understanding is that 70% of the death and custody records produced by states to the department were incomplete, and 40% of those records did not even include a description of the circumstances of death. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. So under DICRA, there's certain types of information that are supposed to be reported. One, the race, ethnicity, gender of the individual who's deceased, the location of the death that happened, what was occurring during that time. So there are a number of different elements, shall we say, that should be reported to DICRA when under DICRA, when they're making reports about what happened. When we looked at the data, as you said, 70% had X amount, 40% had X amount, and so that was a concern as well. I will also like to add, Senator, that our nearly 1,000 deaths that we found, we believe that's an undercount. We were doing a very quick but thorough analysis based on what was available to us, but we are mindful that some of that information might not have been reported anywhere or might have been misreported. And so we do believe that that's an undercount. It's another reason why we're calling on DOJ to do what they can to ensure state compliance with DICRA so that we can have a more accurate picture of what's happening in these correctional institutions.
So let's just crystallize those findings. And I'm so grateful to you and your staff for undertaking that analysis at our request, for supporting this investigation, for your professionalism, for your hard work. I want to condense this down to the key facts I think the public needs to hear. You found nearly 1,000 deaths last year alone, uncounted by DOJ, and you believe it's likely a significant undercount. 70% of the records they did collect were incomplete, and 40% of the records didn't even include a description of the circumstances of death.
That is correct.
The professor on panel 1, Professor Armstrong, discussed how we can't effectively intervene to remedy facility-level abuses, misconduct, poor conditions, poor health units, the kinds of things that lead to higher rates of death in those facilities, unless we know where the problems are. Do you agree with that, Dr. Goodwin?
Yes, we do.
And do you agree that if we don't understand and 40% of the records collected, again, putting aside nearly 1,000 records that were not collected at all and perhaps many more, putting that aside, when 40% of the records don't even include a description of the circumstances of death, that the purpose of this collection to yield insight for policymakers so that we can intervene and save lives is undermined?
Yes, I mean, DICRA was put in place, DICRA was enacted to deal with and minimize deaths in custody. And part of that data collection, once you have the data, you have some idea of what might need to be done. And I will also add that some states might be doing some really good things within their states. We just don't know because that data just isn't being collected. I'd also like to add that even if the data were collected, what we found when in our conversations with DOJ, they don't have any plans to publish the data. So the data would be collected, and what would be done with it is really the question.
Yeah, that's a good segue, Dr. Goodwin. Let me ask you, Ms. Henneberg, please, about that. Why has DOJ ceased to publish this data after nearly 20 years of making this information public? Isn't there an obvious and vital public interest in transparency here?
Well, thank you for that question, Chairman Ossoff. The DICRA 2013 provides that the states report the data, and the department will use that data to analyze the data and study the data to determine what strategies we can use to reduce deaths, as well as the relationship between policies, procedures, management actions relating to these deaths. So yes, the department strongly agrees with GAO that we must strengthen how we collect data under DICRA. And I think our legislative proposal is aimed at fixing this.
Ms. Henneberg, I appreciate that, but my question is why DOJ ceased the publication of this data when it fulfills such a vital public interest?
Thank you for the question. I think it is important to talk about that. Well, from two perspectives, one a legal perspective as well as a data perspective. From the data perspective, the data, as we hear and as we agree with GAO and hearing from the states, there's significant underreporting, and providing that data would be misleading. It would not provide a full picture of what is happening with deaths in custody.
So, Ms. Henneberg, and I'm going to let you complete that answer, but I just want to make sure I hear and understand what you're saying, and the public hears what you're saying. You're saying that you've ceased to publish that data because you no longer have complete and accurate data, correct?
The department are working with the states, who are the central reporters of that data, to collect that data. The states are to collect that data from local agencies and local law enforcement. The states are challenged collecting that data, and we are working with the states through technical assistance. We are looking at open sources to identify those deaths that the states aren't reporting, going back to the states and working with them to improve their data collection.
Okay, Ms. Henneberg, so DOJ has ceased the publication of this data because the data is no longer of sufficient completeness, accuracy, and integrity to publish it. That's the first reason. You were going to give a second reason why you've ceased publication of the data.
Correct. Well, the second reason would be the data under DICRA 2013 is being collected to be analyzed and studied, and we are currently doing that. The National Institute of Justice is undertaking a multi-year effort to review the data, as well as looking at other sources of data to be able to provide findings on relationships between deaths in custody, policies, practices of institutions.
Okay, let's discuss that report, Ms. Henneberg. And so I understand what you're telling us is this data, which was published for 20 years, is no longer being published because of concerns about now the accuracy of the collection of the data, the completeness of the collection of the data. You just mentioned, though, the broader report mandated by Congress in DICRA 2013, correct?
DICRA 2013 provides that
That's
the
right.
data analyzed and studied, correct?
That's right. And DICRA required the Department of Justice to issue a report to Congress, that report to Congress. And I want to, again, and I'm going to pivot for a moment to Dr. Goodwin and get your perspective on why this report is so important. This was a mandate that Congress gave to the department to take the data that's being collected and then investigate it for insights that could yield solutions to reduce the incidence of death in custody. Correct, Dr. Goodwin?
That's correct. And when we last spoke with DOJ in August of 2022, they told us that they had not yet studied the data to determine how that information could be used to reduce deaths in custody, but it sounds like that is happening now.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Goodwin. So Ms. Henneberg, the law required that report to be issued to Congress no later than December of 2016. December of 2016. The department has not yet issued that report, correct?
Correct. The department.
And so we're now almost 6 years past the deadline, right?
The department values that data, and we are studying it, and we are very eager to get the findings so that we can better understand deaths in custody and reduce deaths in custody that can be prevented.
So, Ms. Henneberg, the regular publication of this data that BJS was previously collecting has stopped because now with BJA collecting, the data is not good enough to publish. We've established that. But this failure to report to Congress predates that transition. And back in 2016, when this report was due, BJS was still running the collection and still running the analysis. So there's no excuse here that the data is not good enough, because BJS was doing a pretty good job by most accounts of collecting that data. Why is this report now 6 years late? And am I correct that the department did not even award a contract to a contractor to produce this report until September of 2021? Is that correct?
That is correct for one piece of the study, correct?
Well, just so the department did not award a contract to produce this study. And again, we're talking about studies and contracts and mandates. Let's bring this back to human beings. We're talking about a study whose purpose is to look at data about people dying in prisons and jails and give policymakers at the Department of Justice and the Congress the insight and wisdom based on that data to prevent those deaths, to fulfill an urgent humanitarian purpose. That's why Congress gave that mandate to the department. And what you're telling me is that not only is the report now 6 years late, but the department did not retain a contractor to produce that report until 5 years after it was due. Why?
Well, as Senator, thank you for that question, and it's a good question. BJA began collecting the data in fiscal year 2020, so October of 2019, and data needed to be collected to study. I mean, that is what DICRA 2013 is calling for: collect the data and then study the data so that we can understand the deaths.
But it was due in 2016. How about let's be forward-looking here. Can you give us a date certain when Congress will receive this report that is now 6 years overdue?
There are two parts of that study. One, we do have a draft. The first part, and it's discussed in our report that we put out last week, that will be available. We are estimating by the end of calendar year 2022, and the other is a multi-year effort by NIJ that's not only using the data that is being collected under DICRA 2013, but also other sources. The data elements and the data being collected under DICRA 2013 isn't sufficient to meet the purposes of the study and the scope of the study. So we are expecting that in 2024.
8 years late. Thank you, Ms. Henneberg. Ms. Henneberg, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and I am grateful for your testimony here today, I'm here to work with the department to get this right, because ultimately getting this right is what matters, because lives are on the line. And this isn't about shuffling paper and having these kinds of exchanges in rooms here in the Senate. This is about the Americans who are locked up, many of them pretrial detainees who've been convicted of no crime, who are dying every year, in many cases preventably, who aren't being counted, whose causes of death are no longer being collected, whose locations of death are no longer being collected. And the fact that when we don't get the information that we've tasked you with producing, and the insight and analysis that we've tasked you with producing until 6 or 8 years after the deadline, that has cost human lives. That's why this matters. And I am surely here to work with you and your colleagues. If legislation is what's required, let's legislate. But I'm sure you can understand, Ms. Henneberg, and your colleagues can understand, that for the department to come 8 years after a law is enacted and say you've determined that you cannot implement it successfully, 8 years have now gone by where people have been dying. And I know from my brief time here that when executive branch agencies decide they really need something, they make us aware immediately of what they really need. 8 years have gone by since this law was enacted. And now we're hearing that you can't carry out your mission, that you can't collect accurate and complete data, that you can't publish the data you are collecting because it's not accurate and complete, that you can't produce for us the 6 years late report on what you've learned about saving lives in prisons and jails, because at least in part the data is not complete. And I just have to note, in 2018, the Office of the Inspector General warned that the methodology DOJ was undertaking was likely to fail. Here's what the Office of the Inspector General said: without complete information about deaths in custody, the department will be unable to achieve DICRA's primary purpose, to examine how DICRA data can be used to help reduce the number of deaths in custody. This is 2018. The Office of the Inspector General, your internal watchdog, also wrote, we found the department does not have plans to submit a required report that details results of the study on DICRA data. 4 years ago, the Office of the Inspector General warning that the methodology is not going to work, warning that the report's not going to be produced. The Inspector General also said what Dr. Goodwin has said today. Quote, we believe that not releasing DICRA data and analysis limits the utility of the data collection effort and the department's ability to use the data to increase public transparency about deaths in custody and take steps to reduce their number. And then again in 2021, your statisticians, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, are warning that the methodology is going to fail. We have all those documents. But it wasn't fixed. And again, now 8 years after the law is passed, you're telling us you need legislation. All the while, people have been dying. Where is the urgency?
Chairman Ossoff, I can assure you that the department understands the value of this data, that we understand the critical nature of having the data to know more about deaths in custody. We value the purposes of DICRA 2013 and DICRA previous DICRA 2000 and what it's intended to do. We are faced with a statute that provided that these states collect the data, and we were following that approach. States directly being the central reporters. We have now proposed legislative fixes. The department is committed to fixing this. This current administration, this department is focusing on fixing what we have observed the last couple years with DICRA reporting.
Well, I appreciate that, Ms. Henneberg, and I do want to note that President Biden issued an executive order on May 25th calling for the department to release its plan for full implementation and compliance with DICRA. That was noted. We've received some of the preliminary information. We've got to get this right. We're going to wrap up this hearing in just a moment, but we've got to get this right. Dr. Goodwin, I'm so grateful to you, again, for the analysis and investigation that you undertook in response to our subcommittee's inquiry. And Ms. Henneberg, I appreciate your testimony today. There's no doubt that this has been poorly managed within the Department of Justice, that as a result, the Congress and the Department have been unable to take steps that could have saved lives. But as I said, I'm here to work with you to fix this as soon as possible because it must be fixed. It must be fixed. I'll just close with this, and this brings us back to the experiences of the Americans we heard from in the first panel. Jonathan Fano, Matthew Laughlin, two Americans who were sitting in jail, pretrial detainees convicted of no crime, who died in the custody of their own government, who died preventably in the custody of their own government. And there are thousands more, and tens or hundreds of thousands of family members who have experienced what our two witnesses today experienced. There is an ongoing humanitarian crisis in America's prisons and jails. People are dying every week in America's prisons and jails, many of them preventably. Ms. Henneberg, I hope you leave this hearing fully committed to tasking your entire team with the urgency warranted by a crisis that's taking lives. Dr. Goodwin, I thank you for supporting our efforts to bring transparency to this important issue. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.